Welcome to session 338 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 4th of December. Today we'll be looking at Hebrews 11 to 13 and Psalm 28. But so far in Hebrews, we've read through the comparison between Jesus and the angels, Torah, Moses, Promised Land, the priesthood, and the Old Covenant. Likely written in the 60s CE to Jewish Christians, the letter demonstrates how everything in the Old Testament pointed towards Jesus. The letter opens establishing the supremacy of Jesus in all things. Where previously God spoke to his people through his prophets, he now speaks through Jesus. The author compared Jesus to angels, emphasizing that while angels served as messengers, Jesus is the Son of God. He created and sustains all things and now rules as king. We saw how rejecting the Torah, which was believed to be delivered by angels, brought judgment on people. Therefore, rejecting Jesus' salvation must bring a greater consequence. Unlike the Torah's focus on law and judgment, Jesus brought freedom and redemption. By taking on humanity, Jesus fulfilled humanity's role to rule creation. He suffered, died, and then rose again to defeat death and sin. He now leads believers into glory as his brothers and sisters. The author compared Jesus to Moses, noting that while Moses faithfully served as a prophet and priest, Jesus is greater. Moses was a servant in the tabernacle, but Jesus is the Son of God over God's household. He is the ultimate temple where believers get to meet God. Those who trust in Jesus become part of God's household and share in this greater promise. The author warned against hardening hearts of the Israelites in the wilderness. Their lack of faith kept them from the promised land's rest. Believers now have a hope in a greater rest through Jesus. This begins now and will be fully realized in God's eternal kingdom. They're called to remain faithful, encourage one another, and trust in Jesus' promise of eternal rest. The readers were urged to grow beyond basic teachings. They were warned against rejecting transformation which could harden them to the gospel. And yet despite this, the author expressed hope in their growth and encouraged trust in God's promise through Jesus, the eternal high priest. The author described Jesus as the perfect high priest appointed by God to offer eternal salvation through his obedience and suffering. Unlike human priests, Jesus needed no atonement for himself, empowering believers to overcome sin. Jesus, as a priest in the order of Melchizedek, fulfilled the role of a king and priest. Unlike mortal Levite priests, Jesus offered a better hope through his ultimate sacrifice, requiring no further offerings. Jesus established a new covenant replacing the old one. Unlike the outward laws of the old covenant, this one transforms hearts, enabling a personal relationship with God. As both king and eternal priest, Jesus offered his own blood, granting believers eternal access to God and fulfilling what the old covenant could not. In response, believers were urged to hold fast to their faith, approaching God with sincere hearts and encouraging one another. Rejecting Jesus' final sacrifice leaves no further remedy for sin, only judgment. The author encouraged perseverance, recalling the readers' early faithfulness and urging them to endure until Jesus' return. But let's jump into today's reading, Hebrews 11 to 13. The author now moves into the final section of the letter, pointing to examples of great men and women who have gone before them, and then giving final encouragement on how to hold to this faith well. First, they define faith. Faith is holding on to a hope of something we cannot yet see. It was faith that shaped the faithful men and women of God before Jesus. They did not know Jesus or know exactly what God was going to do, but they had faith in the hope that God would make all things right. The author then lists many great men and women in the Old Testament. Abel, the first good man, offered God his best out of faith. While he died, he was considered righteous, and his story lives on. Enoch, who we can read about in Genesis 5 verses 18 to 24, lived by faith, trusting in God so much that God took him straight to heaven. Neither could see how God was going to fix the world, but they lived faithfully nonetheless. Noah was faithful in building an ark, even though he could not see the rain that was coming. Abraham faithfully left his homeland for the promise of God. He was faithful, on the whole, in trusting that God would provide him with a son in his old age, even though he couldn't see how. Through the faithfulness of Abraham, many generations have been blessed. All these died without seeing what was ultimately promised, but they trusted that it was coming. They recognized that their hope wasn't of this earth. They were like foreigners in a land foreign to them. This wasn't their home, but their home would come. Abraham was faithful in offering up Isaac because he trusted God's promise that he would have descendants through Isaac. He couldn't see how it was going to work, but he remained faithful. Still not receiving the promise, Isaac had faith that it would happen and spoke blessings over his sons. In the same way, when Jacob was dying, he blessed his sons and the sons of Joseph in faith. Moses' parents were faithful in hiding their son despite threats from the king. Moses was faithful, turning down a home of luxury and taking on suffering and a life in the wilderness because he had faith for something better. In faith, he encouraged the Israelites to partake in the first Passover, confident that God would do what he promised and destroy all the firstborns. It was faith that caused the Israelites to travel through the Red Sea into the wilderness. faith that caused the walls of Jericho to fall down, faith that led Rahab to abandon her people for the promise of what God was doing amongst the Israelites. The author points out that the Old Testament is full of people who were able to achieve great things and were willing to go through awful struggles because of a hope and a faith that they had in God. And for each of them, they didn't necessarily experience it in their lifetime. Therefore, if they could stand and persevere in faith, then how much more should believers who now have experienced and know what Jesus has done? In light of these great crowds who have gone before them, believers should also drop the things that hold them back and run forwards in faith. And through it all, keeping their eyes fixed on Jesus, who is the ultimate example. Jesus was willing to face great suffering and shame for the hope that was on the other side. He endured persecution and shed blood, so believers should be willing to face similar hardships. The author then likens it to good discipline. Quoting Proverbs 3 verses 11 to 12, the author points out that good parents correct and discipline their children to develop in them a maturity. In the same way, believers should see difficult times as discipline from God, not punishment. God is not punishing believers with difficult times. This is discipline, not punishment. The two are slightly different. He is using these difficult times to grow believers in maturity. So believers should seek to allow faithfulness in those difficult times to shape and grow them into the likeness of Jesus. The author switches to some practical ways of holding to the faith. Believers should pursue peace over conflict, and they should seek to embody holiness. As a community, they should encourage one another, weeding out any opportunities for bitterness or resentment, as that leads to trouble and tearing people down. They point to the example of Esau. Not appreciating what he had, he gave up his blessing, his inheritance, for a bowl of soup. It was only later that he realized what he had given up and wanted it back, but by then it was too late. In the same way, believers should be careful to not reject the faith, not appreciating what it means until it's too late. This faith is supernatural, meaning it can't be seen or touched. The Israelites, they experienced things. They arrived at Mount Sinai to encounter God, and there were pillars of fire, there was darkness, there were loud noises. There was God's audible voice that struck fear into them. There was the very real reality that if someone touched Mount Sinai while God was on it, they would die. Instead, believers have come to Mount Zion. Here the author is drawing on this Old Testament idea of Zion being an idealized future mountain city where God rules and reigns. While Mount Sinai brought fear and death, this ideal future Mount Zion brings life and freedom. Therefore, do not reject the voice of Jesus that points to this hope. The Israelites were often punished for ignoring God's messages that were brought through human prophets. So therefore, there will be even more punishment for those who ignore Jesus. May believers be defined by mutual love and showing love to strangers and people they don't know. They should support those who are suffering in prison as though they too were suffering. Believers should seek to maintain and strengthen marriages, not weakening them with sexual immorality. They should also avoid money, not putting their confidence in it, but putting their confidence in God. The author then encourages them to remember their leaders who model Jesus for them. They should examine how these leaders live their lives and what fruit they bear. If it's good, they should follow that example. As with other letters going around the churches, the author encourages his readers to not listen to teachings that encourage strict rules for eatings and other things. The author then highlights that under the Old Covenant, priests would leave the tabernacle to get animals and sacrifice them, and then bring the blood back into the tabernacle to offer it on behalf of others. In the same way, Jesus left heaven and came to earth, so that he could return and offer his blood for all. Therefore, likewise, believers should be willing to step outside the boundaries of their own groups and churches, so that they might reach and bless those outside. Then come some final instructions and greetings. Submit to the leaders in the church. Don't make their job harder, as that doesn't benefit anyone. Pray for the author that they might continue to also live right. Timothy has been freed from prison and is looking to visit the anonymous author. They will come together when they visit the original readers. And then the letter finishes. Hebrews is a thorough reminder of the awesomeness of the gospel. Jesus is greater than anything that has come before, and the salvation he brings is complete and perfect. Because of this, believers should be careful to hold on to this message, not ignoring it or abandoning it. They should seek to be faithful in how they live their lives in light of this great hope. But that is the letter to the Hebrews. Now let's look at Psalm 28. This psalm is attributed to King David and falls into the category of lament psalm. There is the possibility that it was a prayer of a king as they were going through a potential threat to their lives. We'll see this at the end of the psalm. Here is a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. We start with verses 1 to 2, a prayer for help. Verses 3 to 5, a prayer for the wicked to be punished. Verses 6 to 8, a declaration of trust in God. And then verse 9, a final request. This lament psalm launches straight into asking God to intervene. The psalmist asks God not to ignore them, to not be deaf or silent to their troubles. Without God, they will continue to fade. The psalmist points out that they have been crying out to God and seeking him in his sanctuary. They've been faithful in seeking God's help, not trying to do it in their own strength. Then comes the second request: punish the wicked. The psalmist clearly has enemies who are causing trouble, and so they ask God to give their enemies what they deserve. These are people who pretend to want the best for others, but they only care about themselves. They do not care about God. Having made the request, the psalmist declares their trust in God. God does hear. He is the strength and shield of his people. And then it mentions that God is the saving refuge of his anointed. That's Psalm 28 verse 8. This is that little cue that the psalmist is a king, as kings were often referred to as God's anointed. Anchored once more into the confidence of God, the psalmist ends with one last request. May he save his people like a shepherd who carries his sheep. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.